Okay, our speaker today is Rudy Shappee.
No, Shappee.
Yeah, I did it incorrectly, so you correct me. Rudy Shappee, and he's got an amazing resume here in bio, but I'm just going to highlight it. He is currently the chief docent on the Midway, and he enlisted in the Navy in '58, served a couple of tours in Vietnam as a helicopter crewman, I think, best describes it.
Yeah.
Okay, and retired as the chief warrant officer in '76 from the Navy. Became an educator after that, taught school, elementary through management and social studies methodologies, lots of education experience during that time. With the Midway since 2002, he's trained volunteers, he developed the education program. There's currently over 400 active serving docents there. He's responsible for that. Don't mess that up, Rudy. He designed, developed and designed exhibits on the Midway 2009 to 2015, including the 9.1 million Battle of Midway exhibit on the Midway 2010 to 2015, did that work. He's also currently the special projects manager and exhibits content director, so we're very lucky to have him speak today. And with that, Rudy Shappee.
Thank you. We at the Midway decided to put $9 million into a 14-minute video in a specially constructed theater and also timelines and all kinds of stuff to tell about the Battle of Midway, because many of our guests believe that the Midway was in the Battle of Midway and not named for the battle.
Yeah.
So we wanted to make that clear why this is such a famous name for a ship and why this is a very, very famous battle in the Second World War. So I spent 5.5 years developing this story using original source documents from both the Japanese after-action reports and U.S. after-action reports, visits to the Pensacola Naval Aviation Museum, going through their archives, reading Shattered Sword, a number of other books that have been written about the Battle of Midway, and myself with Carl Zingheim came up with the story of the 6 minutes. Now we think it's 6 minutes, and a lot of other museums call it 5 minutes. So I'm going to tell you why we believe it actually happened in 6 minutes. So let's start with the beginning of every story. Has to have a beginning, and that's at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese felt that they were intimidated by the United States and forced to attack Pearl Harbor and start World War II. It's because of Roosevelt's rulings to cut oil and scrap metal to the Japanese so that they could not continue their war in China, which had been an ongoing war since 1931. And a very, very hard war for the Japanese because it took a lot of lives, young Japanese men in that war. It was a war that was manipulated and started by the Japanese military cadre. They had overwhelmed the Diet, the Japanese political organization that advised the emperor, and said that they must have this war. The conflict was, do we go to China or do we go south to Borneo and places like that? And after Roosevelt cut off the oil, they had to go south because they had to go to Indonesia. They had to get the oil because they didn't have enough to run their fleet and also their army. So they went south. But what they did when they started the war was to try to force the United States out of Hawaii. Roosevelt had moved the U.S. 7th Fleet out to Hawaii from the coast of the United States because they had been wargaming in the Pentagon, well not in the Pentagon, but the Navy had been wargaming a war with China, or with Japan, ever since the Russo-Japanese War. We knew that ultimately there would be a conflict in the Pacific. So he moved his fleet out to Hawaii, and so the Japanese had to take that fleet out and force the United States out of the Pacific and back to the west coast of the United States, so the Japanese would have free rein to go ahead and move south and be unimpeded in their attacks. The problem, although they sunk a lot of battleships and killed a lot of people and got rid of a lot of airplanes, and also attacked all these other places, they missed the 3 carriers that we had in the Pacific Fleet. We originally had 2, then we brought another one around from the East Coast to the Panama Canal. Those aircraft carriers were delivering aircraft to Guam and Wake and those places in anticipation of a Japanese attack. So this was the extent of the Japanese empire by the time they got through with those initial attacks, had moved south into the Dutch East Indies and French Indochina. So French Indochina, when the French capitulated to the Germans, then the Vichy French were running Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam at the time, Indochina, and the Japanese, because the tripatriate agreement between Italy, Germany, and Japan, felt that they could move into Indochina and occupy that freely, and the Vichy French let them do that. So pretty overwhelming. You know the story of the Philippines, Bataan, all that sort of thing. So they've extended themselves out, taken Wake Island. They have many of these islands in here that were already Japanese as a result of the Japanese involvement in World War I. They were on the right side against the Germans. Many of those islands were colonized by the Germans, and when they settled things in Versailles, the Japanese got all those islands. So, there's nothing but bad news. Roosevelt is saying we've got to have some good news. The papers are blasting the fall of Wake, the heroes of Bataan, all this bad news over and over, daily in the newspapers. We needed some good news. So this guy, by the name of Doolittle, who, by the way, got his wings on North Island, okay, which was an Army Signal Corps aircraft training center at one time, decides that he can get bombers on the Hornet and take them off and bomb Japan. And he does that. And it's very successful. Most of the crews make it to China, and they bomb Japan. There are many photos of that taken during that raid. It shows a lot of smoke over the cities in Japan. It just so happened that the Japanese were having an air raid exercise at the same time, and all that smoke was to cover the ground so that a potential bomber couldn't see it. So those are not explosions of American bombs. They had very few bombs. They were very light, 250 pounders. They didn't do much damage, but they attacked Japan, and Japan had to take notice of that. And the Japanese army, Tojo Hideki, had to go to the emperor and apologize for this attack. The Japanese mainland had never been attacked since the 13th century. So they were very secure, and to have the Americans attack them from an unknown source, they had no idea that the Hornet was out there. Roosevelt said that his planes attacked from Shangri-La, a mythical place in the mountains. And so they had to apologize, and they had to guarantee to the emperor that this would never happen again. So to do that, they had to extend the territory that they were going to be taking, and again, pull those American carriers into battle so they could have the ultimate battle. The Japanese always believed in the ultimate battle that would end the war. There would always be some ultimate thing that would happen. This was going to be it by attacking Midway. Attacking Midway would do two things. It would force the pressure on Hawaii, because they could actually launch missions, long-range bombing missions from Midway Island and attack Hawaii again. Okay? Again, hoping to force that American fleet out of there and hit the oil tanks and all the other stuff that they failed to hit during the initial attack on Pearl. And also, it would extend it down into the Coral Sea and ultimately attack Australia. Okay? That was their ultimate plan, was to take all of the Western Pacific, and that would make them secure and enable them to, again, attack China and finish that war, which had been going on for so many years. Japan was always resource poor, always resource poor. They never had enough oil, they never had enough coal, they never had enough room for even the population of Japan to be able to feed themselves. So they were always importing rice and all these other things that they needed to support their armies. So they had to go south together to get that stuff of war. Battle of Coral Sea, April of 42. This was really an important battle. The Japanese decided that they were going to take Port Moresby, New Guinea, and from there attack Australia, and ultimately seal off the Western Pacific. The United States meets them at the Coral Sea. This is the first battle, naval battle in the history of naval warfare where neither fleet saw each other. All the training for the navies of all the world are always the last war. And the last war were the dreadnoughts, the battleships, the big guns, battling it out as in the First World War. So this changed warfare completely. But all of the carrier commanders in the United States Navy were battleship guys. Okay? They're all trained to fight battleships, not aircraft carriers. And also, there was no coordination between the different aircraft carriers. Each one was commanded by an admiral that was in control of his own aircraft carrier and his air group. So this coordination didn't exist also, which would make fighting a battle very difficult. And you can see that the Japanese lost the light carrier, we lost the Lexington, and the Japanese thought they sunk the Yorktown. They saw the Lexington go down, and then another group saw the Lexington go down and misidentified it as the Yorktown. So they thought they got two carriers in. It was a tactical disaster for the United States Navy, but a strategic win, because we turned them away from Port Moresby. We saved the invasion of Australia. If you ever go to an RSL, Returned Servicemen's League, in Australia, anywhere, go in there and tell them you're from the U.S. Navy, even if you aren't, and you get a beer. Because they all remember that battle, and they remember how the U.S. Navy saved them from invasion from the Japanese. So Yamamoto, who's a master planner in the Japanese Navy, who had been stationed in the United States for a number of years, spoke English very well, hell of a poker player, decided that what he was going to do was to take Midway and the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutian Islands mostly for a political gain, to be able to put it in the Asahi newspapers that the Japanese had invaded the United States territory of Alaska. But mostly what they wanted to do was to suppress the forces on Midway and find the U.S. carriers. Now that's one of the problems. Yamamoto's plans were always very intricate. They had hundreds of moving pieces on his chessboard at a time. So there was a lot of opportunity for failure. And this was one of them. Admiral Nagumo, who led the task force that bombed Pearl Harbor, was given the task of both suppressing Midway and finding the U.S. carriers. Now, if you find the U.S. carriers, what are you going to do to sink them? It's a different weapon than you'd use in bombing an island. Okay? So one requires high explosives, the other requires torpedoes and bombs that have delayed fuses on them to get inside the carriers to explode them. So he has two different missions to carry out with his 4 carriers. Yamamoto's in the background with his battleships. What's going to happen is Nagumo's going to attack the island, going to suppress the air groups there, and go on to find the U.S. fleet. Yamamoto's going to come in with his big guns. He's going to then sink those carriers with his big guns, and then the Japanese or lead forces are going to come in and attack the island, land, and capture the island. And then this strategic feint to the Aleutians is to draw the American carriers north and away from Midway and supporting Midway. So it's a very complex plan, and it's doomed to fail because of that, mostly. There were a number of other occasions, and this is, of course, what Yamamoto really wants. Midway, you can take Midway anytime, but if you can take out those 3 carriers, the United States has no aerial support, and Yamamoto knows it's an aerial war. And so that would really put us at a disadvantage. Here's the first miracle. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort. An eccentric, had been stationed in Japan for 7 years in the embassy, spoke fluent Japanese, and is known for wearing his slippers and a smoking jacket and wandering around in his offices under the naval building on Ford Island. And he knew or understood the Japanese psyche and how the Japanese thought. And so and by the way, he used, in breaking the Japanese code, he used Navy bandsmen who already understood code, because that's music. So they already had a mindset to be able to do this work. They didn't break the code quite yet. It says that Japanese code was broken by Hypo in April. Actually, it wasn't broken, but what they did was they could tell by the rhythm of the messages moving from place to place within the Japanese Empire that there were certain activities occurring in certain places where certain ships were, and there was other activity in other places. And every person who sends code has a signature. Every person sends code in a different manner. And so they could identify a sender from a certain ship by the message that they're hearing over the airwaves. So that was a real key of analyzing what ships were where and where they were moving and how they were getting together to make this attack. Rochefort's not sure of where they're coming. He knows they're either coming to the Aleutians or the Midway is going to be the center of the main attack. Admiral King in Washington, who's the head of the Navy, says they're coming to the Aleutian Islands. Send the carriers to the Aleutians. Rochefort says, I'm not so sure. They may be going to Midway. But how are we going to make the decision on how we're going to decide which way they're going to go? In the 1920s, the Americans had laid a underwater telegraph cable from San Francisco to Hawaii to Midway to Japan. When the war started, they cut the cable at Midway. But they still had that cable between Hawaii and Midway. So Rochefort says, send an underwater telegram to Midway Island stating in the air that our evaporators are down, we have emergency need for fresh water. And so that's transmitted. 2 days later, the Japanese send a coded message saying, send extra water for the invasion of Midway.
Wow.
Rochefort gets it. Okay? King doesn't. And there's going to be another conflict that I'll talk to you about later. So the phony message, AF is going to be the main target. So Nimitz then knows where to send his carriers. This is the order of battle. You can see the big guns. CVs are carriers. BVs are battleships. CAs and CLs are heavy and light cruisers. Other service ships and personnel carrying ships and so on. Carrier aircraft, the Japanese have 303, we have 261. And we also have 61 land-based aircraft on Midway Island. Remember, that's what those carriers were doing when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So it looks like we have a slight advantage in the air, a definite disadvantage on the surface of the sea. And these are the aircraft. I thought you guys would love this, so this is all about the airplanes. The Devastator, the pilots who flew the Devastator called it the Vibrator. It had to go under 100 knots and 50 feet over the water in order to be able to release its torpedo. Very slow-moving aircraft. One of the first mono-wing torpedo bomber in the United States inventory. The Wildcat, a great aircraft, solid as a tank, take a lot of punishment, sealed gas fuel tanks, lots of armor plating to protect the pilot, slower than the Zero, but they used it to great advantage. The Dauntless, a great airplane, a dive bomber. It had two different methods of attacking. One was called slope attack, which they just came in very slowly and made long-range attacks, and then they had the dive where they came in at an angle of 70 degrees, almost straight down, and dropped their weapons. The Marines used the slope attack. The Navy used the vertical. And then the Catalina, God bless her, San Diego built, had been building them for a number of years, and this thing would fly for 12 hours. on a tank of gas. And long-range reconnaissance, boring as hell, but very, very important to winning the battle. On Midway, the Army was represented by flying fortresses. They had 8 of them. They had 4 Marauders. The Marine Corps had the Buffalo. That's the first monowing fighter in the Navy inventory. Slow, hard to fly, hard to do anything except get it in and out of the air. And the Avenger, the Avengers squadron was supposed to replace the Devastators on the Hornet, but they missed, the ship sailed and they got to Hawaii, so they flew out to Midway, and there were 4 of these that finally got to Midway and were in the battle. But this is the aircraft that's going to replace the Devastator. This is state-of-the-art stuff. This is the one George H.W. Bush flew. Not during the Battle of Midway. This is a Japanese. So you had the Kate, was a torpedo bomber, a good, steady, hard-working airplane. 3 people in it. They had a guy, and they had a tail gunner. They had another guy in there who actually laid down in the fuselage and aimed a torpedo from an opening under the aircraft. The Val, which was a dive bomber, even though it had fixed landing gear, it was very fast, very durable aircraft, very effective. And the Zero, at the time the fastest airplane in the Pacific. You never wanted to try to outturn a Zero. He could outturn you and kill you on the inside of the curve. So the Americans attacking a Zero had to come straight through it, dive below it, and get the hell out of there. Make one pass. You didn't get in a dogfight with a Zero because they would kill you, because they had no self-sealing gas tanks, no armor for the pilot, no nothing except a fuselage with an engine on the front of it with guns. And that was how that airplane was built. Great airplane. And the Jake. Very few people think about the Jake, but the Jake was a reconnaissance aircraft that was flown from the cruisers as a scout to find the enemy and notify the forces of their location. That Jake is going to play a key role in the United States winning of the Battle of Midway. So the Hornet, let's go back to Yorktown. She was badly beat up during the Battle of Coral Sea, and anticipated 90 days to fix her. Nimitz says, no, you've got 48 hours, get her back into battle. So they actually took a number, what does it say, did I put a number up there? No, 72. But there were a large number of naval engineers that set sail with the Yorktown, and were still patching her up en route to the battle. So this is what's going to happen. Yamamoto has split his forces. He's coming in from the northwest with his aircraft carriers. He's coming in about the center with his Second Fleet transport group, and then his support forces are coming into the south. The United States forces are coming out of Hawaii. First of all, the Task Force 17, the Hornet and the Enterprise, come out first under Fletcher and move to an area 350 miles northeast of the Midway. And during the time of the battle, there's lots of clouds and there's lots of small storms going through the area. So the U.S. forces are actually hidden back in this front, and so are the northern forces of the Japanese. They're coming in a rainstorm, so we can't find them either. And so the key is that the Japanese are going to have submarines blocking those U.S. carriers as they go out of Hawaii and sink them before they ever get to the battle. A great plan, a lot of moving pieces. A lot of good naval art at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. So here's the timeline of the battle. So we've got Hypo determining Midway as a target on the 14th. Japanese forces leave on the 27th. Enterprise and the Hornet sailed for Point Luck. Got all that done. Yorktown finally sailed, and the Japanese submarine formed their barrier 2 days after the U.S. carriers passed through the line where the Japanese submarines are making their block. They're 2 days late. Another great information. PBY from Midway spots the Japanese fleet on the night of the third attacks and hits a Japanese transport with a torpedo, doesn't sink it, but that is actually what a lot of people say is the opening of the battle. The Midway-based aircraft strike, the Japanese launched their first strike at Midway, and by the way, John Ford, I think it is John Ford. Great, we all know John Wayne Westerns. Well, John Ford was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and he was hired to go out to Midway to film the battle. And so he was there, and he was standing atop a bunker filming the attack. So if you go to YouTube, John Ford, Midway, Battle of Midway, you can see his color video. And it ends very abruptly when a bomb lands next to him and blows hell out of his camera and him, and he gets a Purple Heart. But at least part of that battle is filmed. So they attacked Midway. The Midway-based aircraft attacked Japanese forces with no hits, and the Japanese aircraft attacked Midway at 7:15. Now, a lot of American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet, and they get no hits. The Army doesn't get any hits, the Marine Corps doesn't get any hits, the Navy doesn't get any hits. No one can hit anything in the Japanese fleet, because most of our aircraft are antiquated, they're slow, the admirals aren't talking to each other, and we have all the reasons to lose a battle here. And it looks like we're beginning to lose it. So at 8:10, the 2nd Midway Force attacks the Japanese, again, no hits. You can read. U.S. Carrier Force attacked the Japanese fleet at 9:20. Now, Waldron. Some of you know all about Waldron. He was the commanding officer of Torpedo Squadron 8. We feature Torpedo Squadron 8 in our movie that we play on the Midway because of the sacrifice they made. The torpedo squadrons were notoriously slow, vulnerable, low speed, and so on. And the torpedoes had been conserved by the Navy Ordnance Department because we had so few of them. Many of the pilots had never even carried a torpedo on an aircraft, let alone ever dropped one. So these kids were totally, learning as they were going. And so you can see there that they paid heavily for that. Waldron was at odds with his carrier group commander. His carrier group commander said that the Japanese forces were coming from the south. And Waldron said, no, they're coming from the north, where the Japanese actually were. The carrier group commander and the admiral says, follow the carrier group commander's orders, go north. So Waldron goes north and then suddenly turns south, disobeying orders, and takes his squadron into the Japanese fleet and loses all of his airplanes. Everybody dies, except for one guy, Ensign Gay. And you can see the others, the losses of the other squadrons were very, very heavily high destroys. But, and although they obtained no hits, all 3 squadrons were supposed to attack at the same time. But 2 of the squadrons are going south, and only Waldron's going north. So he only has 1 squadron. And the tactic to put a torpedo into a Japanese ship was that when a Japanese ship sees you're attacking, they turn away. So you want to attack them from both sides. But there aren't 2 squadrons. There's only 1. And they're not able to coordinate their attacks, so they miss, and get no hits. The Japanese fighter pilots, there's a carrier air patrol. Whenever you're in harm's way, you always launch a number of fighters to just circuit around over the top of the carrier in case they have fighters coming in or anything to attack the ship. You can then be sent out to take care of that. They come down and attack those devastators down on the water, okay, and shoot hell out of them. Knock everybody down. You can see only 7 of 30-some aircraft returned to the ship. And because of this, they left their patrol areas above the carriers to shoot down those aircraft. And the Japanese carriers are unable to recover aircraft who have been down at Midway and coming back low on fuel because they're trying to stay away from those devastators. And so they can't run into the wind to recover their aircraft. So their aircraft are starting to run out of gas. Things couldn't get worse. But here's Nagumo. Remember, he's supposed to attack Midway, and he's supposed to attack the carriers. Well, after the first attack is over, his carrier group commander comes back and says, we're not finished. We've got to go back to Midway and finish the job, like we didn't do in Hawaii. Well, Nagumo is holding a large number of aircraft on his flight deck that are loaded with torpedoes and bombs to attack the American fleet, which he has yet to locate. Okay, can't find them yet. They're up there hiding in a rainstorm. And so his carrier group commander says, we got to go back. So Nagumo says, okay, we don't know, we can't find the American fleet. There's no threat there. We'll go ahead and take the torpedoes and the heavy bombs off. We'll put back heavy explosive bombs that will go back to attack Midway. Okay. So then, remember those Jakes, those scouting planes? They're sending them off the cruisers and they're sending them out to look for the U.S. fleet. They're all out like this, except it's not like this at all. It's like this. Because one of those Jakes failed to catapult. The catapult failed on his cruiser and he did not leave for over an hour. Guess where the U.S. fleet was? Right there. Okay. So they didn't locate the U.S. fleet until after Nagumo was busy changing over all these weapons to re-attack Midway. Then the word comes in from this Jake that says, I spotted some American ships. Holy. We got to change again. We found the American fleet. We got to change all the way back. In the meantime, those U.S. dive bombers from the Yorktown and Enterprise find the fleet, and we're going to have the 6 minutes. So he can't recover his aircraft. He's got a lot of aircraft loaded with weapons on his flight deck, and they're in such a hurry they do not store the unused weapons back down in the magazines. They're all down on the hangar deck, right under, and by the way, flight decks were made of wood in those days. Wood. Mahogany or pine. So, because they didn't want the ships to be top heavy. So Nagumo, this is Nagumo's dilemma. This decision, I believe, puts a frosting on the cake. This is why the United States won, because he can't launch aircraft, he can't recover aircraft, he's got all these aircraft loaded with weapons. They don't, another thing, their fuel lines, when they used to refuel aircraft on Japanese aircraft, are not purged. And U.S. aircraft carriers, they purge them with CO2. So we've got fuel in all the fuel lines. They're along the edges of the flight deck, ready to refuel the aircraft. Bad, bad, bad. So, Lieutenant Commander Wayland McCluskey, the Nautilus, a U.S. submarine, has been located down south by a Japanese destroyer and has been attacking the submarine ineffectually, and so breaks off the attack and is heading north to join the Japanese forces. McCluskey, who went south, sees that destroyer, turns around, he's carrier group commander, and follows it back to the Japanese fleet, and they discover the Japanese carriers. Now, McCluskey is a fighter pilot, but if you're a carrier group commander, you can fly any damn thing you want. So he decides he's going to be a bomber pilot today. So in fighter pilot technolese, whatever that word is, I guess his process was to say, follow me. And so when he makes his attack on the Japanese forces, he says, follow me. And that's when they first turn over and start making their dives on the Japanese fleet. That's where we started our clock. They're joined by VB-5 from Yorktown, and the first bombs are dropped, strike the Kaga, and the Soryu is right in the very, very near area. And they just have, all you have to do is hit the flight deck. Everything goes through into the hangar deck. All those torpedoes and bombs that have been stored down there, all that gasoline blows up, and you've got the hull, which still will float, but you'd have no place to land airplanes, which means Japanese airplanes are going to have to find another deck, or they're going to have to go in the water. Lieutenant Best, the VB-6, is following McCluskey, but sees that all the airplanes are attacking one carrier, so he peels off and has some guys follow him and takes out the Akaga. So 3 Japanese carriers are disabled and on fire. They're not sunk. They're disabled. They can't be used any longer. Okay? In flames, a lot of people dead, a lot of aircraft gone. Another piece of great art from the museum. At 1200, a little later in the day, a Japanese aircraft from the Hiryu attack Yorktown and get a bomb into its smokestack. And the concussion from that blows out the boilers that are producing the steam to drive the turbines and run. Steam on an aircraft carrier is like the blood in your body. It runs everything. So it blows out all those boilers except one. It's a first-class petty officer who has been selected for chief, and he gets his boilers still running, so it provides enough steam to get the other boilers going. Yorktown can now get underway and launch another attack. So secondary, at 2:54, the Japanese hit from the hero attack again, this time getting two torpedo hits, and the carrier is disabled. The admiral moves his flag to a cruiser, and the captain decides to abandon ship. So he orders abandon ship, everybody leaves, except two guys who are left down in sick bay, who are thought to be so badly injured that they can't be moved, and so everybody else goes to cruisers and destroyers and so on. A hell of a story about those two guys. One of them has a stomach wound, a concussion wound. He's got a towel wrapped around his body to hold his intestines in, and another guy has a really bad brain injury. And they wake up, and they're both alone on the ship. Not a sound, not a blower, nothing. And so the kid with the internal injuries crawls up to the flight deck and gets out to a gun position and fires a .50 caliber machine gun into the water in the direction of a destroyer. The destroyer thinks they're under attack again, but they find there's no airplanes, and they finally discover that the bullets are coming from Yorktown. They send a boat back across and bring those two guys out. So there's nobody left aboard the ship.
Wow.
The young kid who fired the gun dictated a letter to his mother and died. A hero of Midway, you don't hear about those guys, not ever. So the Yorktown is on its way to the Pearl, and the Enterprise finally attacked the Hiryu, setting up fire, and during that night, the Japanese have to sink their carriers. That was very common for the big carriers. It's very difficult to sink them. Many compartments. The Midway has 2,000 compartments. It's very hard to sink one of these things. So the Japanese and the Americans had to sink their own carriers ultimately during most of these battles. So the Japanese turn away, and two of their cruisers collide in the middle of the night, and one gets its fuel tanks punctured, and off they go back to Japan. But the next morning, the Americans find the fuel spill, and they follow it, and end up that this is what happens to the Japanese cruiser. That again, the Japanese have to sink it with their own torpedoes, but it's totally disabled. Then the bad news. One of those submarines, the I-168, is coming north, and it spots the Yorktown. And so it puts two torpedoes into it, or four torpedoes, I'm sorry, two hits. And while the carrier is being moved, it's very common to have a destroyer alongside to provide electrical power to the disabled ship. So you can still have some controls of the rudders and so on. So the destroyer is sitting alongside the Hammond, and one of the torpedoes cuts that destroyer right in half. And unfortunately, they did not save their depth charges before the battle. So when the destroyer sank, its crew jumps into the ocean, and they are killed from concussion from those exploding depth charges. And this is the Haven, and then ultimately the Yorktown will sink, will roll over and sink quite a lot. So they lost their battle, they lost their momentum in the Battle of Midway. 2,500 pilots. The Japanese pilot training program is very minuscule. They only select the best potential pilots, and most of them are enlisted men because they think that flying is a technical matter, and enlisted men can do technical stuff. So there were very few officers and pilots in the Japanese Navy. Usually squadron and air group commanders, that sort of thing, were officers, but they led enlisted personnel. So when you come to the Midway, you see our Japanese pilot. He's wearing a second-class petty officer rating badge. But the Japanese never recover from these losses and loses their aviation superiority, the Army and the Navy of Japan never got along. They were always warring for the same assets because the Japanese military was short of everything. So when the Navy lost its naval air superiority, it had to go to the Army to get planes to protect its ships. And the Army always said, "We're really busy. Things going on in China." So that ended ultimately would end up destroying the Japanese Navy because they had no air cover for their ships. And the Japanese went on the defensive. Finally, no more bad news, okay? No more bad news. Now the Americans are winning. Another little side note is that Roosevelt didn't want the public to know that the Navy was the one that destroyed those Japanese ships. So he had reporters say, American bombers destroy Japanese, U.S. Army bombers destroy Japanese fleet. The Army didn't hit a single thing with anything except the water, and they get the credit because they didn't want anyone to know how powerful and how good our Navy bomber crews were. So ultimately, Yamamoto's in disgrace. Submarines now can operate out of Midway, which means a lot shorter route between their home base and the Sea of Japan, where they're going to destroy the Japanese merchant fleet. And we see that the U.S. forces can stay in Hawaii instead of Bremerton and San Francisco and San Diego. And another really important thing was Roosevelt could now turn to Europe and say, okay, he always wanted to turn to Europe, but he couldn't do it because of the decisions of the American public, and also because of the hard things that were happening to us in the Pacific. So he was now able to turn to Europe and supply the British and so on to take out Hitler. And they say it shortened the war by a year. They also say the Battle of Philippine Sea shortened the war by a year. Who knows? It's all hindsight. And also it caused the Navy to get a central command for those individual admirals to coordinate with one another, so they would have one attack plan instead of individual ones created by each ship. A little side note: the Fletcher's command was supposed to be commanded by Halsey, and Halsey was just as big a poker player as Yamamoto was. He was very, very aggressive. Very aggressive. And Yamamoto knew that he was going to be in command of that carriers. So when the battle was over, the night the battle was over, Fletcher turned away from Midway and went to the northeast. Yamamoto planned that Halsey would attack him because Halsey was such an aggressive admiral that he would go right after those battleships even though he only had carriers. Halsey was in a hospital with shingles and had been replaced by Fletcher. Ta-da! Another little piece. Okay? And that, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I thought I'd throw this one in just for you folks. Air and Space. So that's the end of the war. U.S. Army's doing a lot of good stuff. Army Air Corps. And that's part of our exhibit of working with you. Thank you very much.
Maybe at our last session we had, there was a presentation by one of your associates of the Battle of Coral Sea.
Yes.
And he made the comment that the loss of the Japanese one or two carriers, you mentioned one carrier, one damage. He said if they had not been lost, they would perhaps have been in the Midway
Absolutely,
event.
they were planned for that.
And the consequences would have been...
Could have been.
Could have been.
There were a lot of things that happened.
Right.
And Nagumo's having all those weapons on his flight decks, not being able to launch his fuel-heavy aircraft because of the vibrators attacking. A lot of could-have-bees, would-have-bees, and that's what war is about. It's all could-have-bees. They say it's a great plan to the first bullet's fired, and it all goes to hell. So that's my story. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, sir.
At the beginning of World War II, the Japanese had the largest navy in the world.
Not true.
That's what we were told.
Yeah.
No?
I think you need to check out the British.
British had the largest navy?
They-
Well,
That's my information. I don't know who told you that
Let me
information.
go back and restart. At the beginning of World War II, the Japanese had a very large power.
Very, very large, yes.
Okay. If I'm not incorrect, there's a guy, an author named James Brady, that wrote Flags of Our Fathers.
Yeah.
He also wrote another book called Flyboys.
Yes, great book.
It's a great book.
Yes.
I highly recommend it to everybody.
Yes.
inside, right, in this conference. In that book, he spends a lot of time at the beginning of the book talking about the history of Japan.
Uh-huh, good.
It's been years since I read it, but what I understood to be true was that an American Navy sailed into the Bay of Tokyo back in the 1800s
Yes,
with
Perry.
the purpose of developing coaling stations for the whaling fleet. The Japanese had never seen a white hat.
That's true.
They were a non-mechanized society,
Shogunate.
okay?
Yeah.
So whatever the date was, let's say it was 1850.
A little later. Yeah.
Okay, let's say it was
It doesn't make a difference.
1860.
It was still in the
1870.
1800s, late
Okay.
1800s.
So they had no mechanization.
Right.
They had no big ships. They had no submarines. And
They had
In
no need for
19
it because they had kamikaze. Kamikaze, the great wind that destroyed the Chinese fleet when they tried to attack. And a kamikaze before that destroyed another fleet. They didn't need to have a big navy because they had the gods of the winds to protect them. And that's why they hadn't been invaded since
Well,
1300.
somebody changed their tune because they built a big navy
they
going
went-
into World War II.
They hired the British to come in and train their officer cadre, who were former samurai, and who had been out of business since the shogunate had failed at the turn of the century. And they brought in the Germans, who were great engineers, to help them design their ships. So, and they finally got the French to teach, or not the French, I think it's the Belgians, to teach them how to use guns.
According to the author, he says that back then Japan was a very isolationist society.
Yes,
Nobody was allowed in, nobody was allowed out, so they didn't know about the rest of the world. When the Americans came and they finally found out about the rest of the world, they learned about imperialism around the world. And when I say that, I'm talking about the English,
the Dutch,
especially,
The Germans.
all going around the world, taking over land, developing colonies, and
Yes.
here's Japan, all during those years, sitting there isolationist,
Mhm.
they're not in the game.
right,
But when they learned that this was happening, they said, we gotta get in the game.
that's it.
Am I right?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay, so in that very short period of time, they built a huge navy. Now, I know they used scrap iron from the United States to do it, but it was a tremendous feat.
Yes, it was a
And it's not really
miracle.
recognized.
It was an economic miracle. Also, they adopted democracy and even had a movement to enfranchise women during that time, during the first Meiji, they call it the Meiji Restoration, after the shogunates. There's a lot of great history. I'm reading a book, really a great book right now, called Japan 1941. And it's the arguments within the government of Japan on whether or not to go to war with the United States. And it's very complex. A lot of people didn't want to go to war because they knew they couldn't win, that they had to take the United States out in 3 months or lose the war. And many of them knew they couldn't do it and voted to do it.
Another thing,
We're kind of going over time here.
I'm
I
sorry,
don't know about
real quickly, that he explains, I think it's called the Bushido Society.
Bushido.
Society, which
Yeah.
is the warrior society,
Yes.
which goes all the way back hundreds of years to
The samurai.
samurais, and how they are totally victorious over their captors. They treat them like crap. They have no respect for them, and it's that mind thought that took the Japanese into the World War II and why they brutalized like the March of
Well,
Bataan.
that's how they were trained. The soldiers were trained.
It was built into their
trained-
culture.
Yeah, they were trained that way. The enlisted men were not thought of as being anything except cannon fodder. The code, you remember that saying, what is it? To fight is like climbing a mountain, but to die is as easy as a falling petal or something like that. That was adopted by the Japanese military in 1890. That's where it began.
Very soon
That
before
whole
World War II.
thing was going to be we die, we don't give up.
In contra, you're right about everything you're saying in terms of the Japanese developed so quickly leading up to World War II. However, the thing you need to understand is that in the same amount of time during World War II, the Japanese developed 18 aircraft carriers of all different types, both fleet carriers as well as light carriers. The United States, during the same amount of time, 126 carriers.
Yeah. The
And
industrial
that basically is what really turned the war.
And the
It's-
Jeep and
it's-
the escort carriers relieved the Navy battle forces by escorting transports and all that stuff around the Pacific and the Atlantic, using TBMs and TBFs, the ones that George Bush flew, using those to keep the submarines down, so that the Navy, the fighters and the bombers could then go off and attack the Japanese forces. So a lot of stories here, guys. We can go on all day. Yeah.
Very, very good comment. I think Japan started showing tremendous power as early as 1905. As you
Yes.
know, they were able to have a decisive naval victory against Imperial Russia.
Yes.
And imagine 1905 it started showing that tremendous power. You can imagine what happened by the time they reached World War II.
And before
Well,
that,
But my point is like the Americans, we were building ships back in the 1700s. England had been building ships for who knows how long. They had, like you said, that they had the biggest navy in the world. What do they have today? I mean, I've seen recently that the state of the British Navy